It's my joy to be able to introduce my colleague in the history department. Margaret Jacobs is the Charles Mach Professor of History. She is also the director of the Great Plains Center. She earned her baccalaureate degree at Stanford University and then her master's and doctoral degrees at the University of California, Davis. She began her career at New Mexico State University, but in 2004, we were able to lure her to Nebraska away from New Mexico and to keep her here ever since. Margaret has published 4 books so far in her career that deal with colonialism, issues of a settler society, indigenous peoples, and she has done that from a comparative perspective, comparing the experience in the United States with comparable experiences in Australia and Canada. Margaret's second book, which is White Mother to a Dark Race, Settler Colonialism, Maternalism, and the Removal of Indigenous Children in the American West and Australia, 1880 to 1940. That book won the Bancroft Prize in American History. For those of you outside of the field of history who may not be familiar with the Bancroft Award, that's the equivalent of a Pulitzer Prize. That's one of the most distinguished prizes that anyone can ever earn within the field of American history. That's one of her marks of recognition. She also was invited to be the Pitt Professor of American History and Institutions at Cambridge University in England. There are 2 professorships, one at Cambridge, the other at Oxford, that are only given to some of the most distinguished American historians, and she went to Cambridge as the Pitt Professor. So it's my honor and privilege to introduce my dear colleague, Margaret Jacobs.
I recognize a lot of wonderful familiar faces, and some people I've only met on Zoom. But it's really great to be here, and what a pleasure to be introduced by my wonderful colleague Lloyd Ambrosius, and also to have another of my colleagues here, Jessica Koop. So thank you so much for inviting me. I'm going to be talking today about the Genoa Indian School Reconciliation Project. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm not the only person involved in this project. It's a huge team of people, and we have 3 co-directors, and one of them is Liz Lorang of the libraries, and another is Susanna Halaga, and Susanna was my PhD student and now teaches at University of Nebraska, Omaha. And so we're a really great team, but we also have a lot of students who work with us, and we've hired project managers and things like that over the years. And for those of you who know me, I don't have a lot of technical skill. You'd be amazed that I'm doing a digital project. But luckily, Liz Lorang at the libraries is very involved in the Center for Digital Research in the Humanities. And so she's our real tech expert on our project. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about how I got started on this project. So from Lloyd's introduction, you get the idea that one of the areas I've been researching for a very long time is what I call indigenous child removal, which is a policy of many settler colonial states to remove Indian children or indigenous children from their families and to separate them. And this policy went on for over 100 years, starting in the late 19th century and well into the late 20th century. And it first involved removing children to institutions, and then later involved still removing children, but taking them into the child welfare system and putting them up for adoption. So I've written a couple books about that. But it was inescapable as I was working on that two of the places I was studying this, Canada and Australia, were actually having major national dialogues about this and were taking major steps to make some sort of reparations for this, both financial reparations, but all sorts of other things, including apologies and inquiries and areas where people can give testimony about their experiences. And so one of these places was in Australia in the 1990s. They had what they called the Stolen Generations Inquiry, in which they spent months gathering testimony from Aboriginal people who as children had been removed from their families. And then it took a long time, but they finally apologized to Aboriginal people for those policies in 2008, and that's what you see here on this slide. And similar things were going on in Canada around the same time. They also apologized to Indigenous people there in 2008, just a couple months after the Australian government did, for policies of removing Indigenous children to Indian residential schools. And maybe some of you were following that the Pope was just in Canada about 2 months ago, apologizing as well for the Indian residential schools. And Canada had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that went on for 6 years, and this was, Murray Sinclair was one of the people who led this. He was one of 3 commissioners who led this. And as I mentioned, both nations gave apologies. This is Stephen Harper apologizing for the residential schools in the Canadian Parliament in 2008. I was so moved by these efforts that I thought, well, I should go. I should interview people. I did interview several people, Mick Dodson, for example, in Australia, who led their Stolen Generations inquiry, and I also got to interview Murray Sinclair in Canada. But I also thought, well, I could go to the ceremonies that they do in Canada for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So in 2015, I went to the final ceremony that was in Ottawa, and it was really incredibly moving to me. There were people giving testimony about what they'd experienced in the schools. There were a lot of scholars there, a lot of historians as well, from Canada who were very involved in trying to expose what happened in the schools, but also to work towards some sort of reconciliation. So I was really influenced by this, and I thought to myself, what could I do as a scholar in the United States to further our own reckoning with our own history of Indian boarding schools and the removal of Indigenous children? So that was like the first seed that was planted in my brain. And then later that year, this was in 2015, I was at a conference and I met the people that started the Carlisle Indian School Digital Resource Center. Many of you may know Carlisle was the most famous of the Indian boarding schools, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it later. But I met these folks who started this at Dickinson College in Pennsylvania, which is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And I was really inspired by them, too. And I thought, oh my gosh, we have an Indian boarding school right in Nebraska, in Genoa. And maybe that's something I could do, is I could start a project to recover that history and work toward reconciliation around this. I was, as you can tell, I was very influenced by Truth and Reconciliation. And one of the big issues in Canada was trying to get all the documents about the schools, and it's still an issue. The Catholic Church is still not making available the documents that they want, the Indigenous communities want in Australia. So I thought, maybe I can do something here. So that was the year I went to Cambridge, and when I came back, I immediately started reaching out to the folks in Genoa, Nebraska. They had already established, they had been working for decades, really, on trying to commemorate this history of Genoa and to reach the survivors of the school. And they succeeded in getting the one remaining building from the Indian school, which was the Manual Arts Training Building. They've created a museum and an interpretive center out of it, and also put it on the Register of Historic Places. And they've also been holding reunions every year since 1990 for survivors of the Genoa Indian School. And now we don't think there are any survivors left, but they still hold reunions, and a lot of descendants come back every year. They also, in their interpretive center, which is really beautiful, and it's all volunteer run, and it always just amazes me how professionally they've done this, even though they're all volunteers. Oops, we're going. So children of over 40 different tribal nations attended Genoa Indian School, and so they have flags from all the tribes that attended the school. So if you haven't gotten a chance to visit, I'd really recommend it. They're open in the summer months, not so much in the winter because it's extremely hard to heat. So another thing we did immediately, I reached out to Liz, Lorang. We knew from the outset that both Liz and I are not Native. We knew from the outset that we did not want to do this project without major involvement from Native people in Nebraska. So first we reached out to Judy Gayashkabash. Many of you may know her. She's the executive director of the Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs. And we asked, we would like to start this project. Would you be interested and would you like to help us? And Judy had aunts and her mother who attended Genoa Indian School, and she was very interested in being involved. And she helped us connect with the 4 headquartered tribes in Nebraska, the Ponca, the Santee Sioux, the Omaha, and the Winnebago. And so we created a community advisory council from the very beginning with representatives from all of these nations. Here's another picture of us. We try to meet at least 2 times a year. Sometimes we've actually met at the Interpretive Center in Genoa. Sometimes we meet at UNL, or sometimes in communities like the Omaha community. The advisory council really makes all the key decisions about the project and what documents we should collect, what documents we should make available, whether there's any kind of restrictions we should put on any material. So in addition to Judy Gayashkabash, she agreed to be a co-chair of our Community Advisory Council. We also have James writing in, Dr. James writing in. He was a history professor at Arizona State. He's now retired. He's a member of the Pawnee Nation. And the Pawnee were the tribal group that was displaced from Genoa, Nebraska, where this school was established. So one of the things our community advisors did was we came to them. I'm going to show you the Carlisle page again really quickly. We came to them with a digital website very similar to this. Lots of text, not particularly inviting. And they said, we don't like that. We want it to feel inviting. We want it to be colorful. We want it to be, really foreground the indigenous people. And so this is the design they came up with and approved. And so we have a lot of photos on the website. We have the design is from a Winnebago artist named Henry Payer. So I'm extremely proud of this because I think that our community advisors just, told us the right thing, that you really need to make this much more inviting. So one of the first challenges we faced in the project was finding all the documents. So that may seem straightforward, and we hoped it would be, because Carlisle, all their student files, all the documents related to Carlisle Indian School are in one place in Washington, D.C. at the National Archives. But that was not true for Genoa. We had a tough time finding the records, and they're scattered all over the United States. But we did find a big cache of them at the National Archives in Denver and the National Archives in Kansas City. and some papers at the Oklahoma State Historical Society. And then there's a student newspaper as well. So that's where we started. And we launched this website in 2018. So why are we doing this? So again, I want to foreground this logo on the left side of your screen. This is also designed by Henry Payer, the Winnebago or Ho-Chunk artist. And we wanted to do this as an act of digital repatriating government documents. Because if they're hard for historians to find, they're much harder for everyday citizens to find. And so we wanted to bring them together in an accessible place so that descendants of the survivors of the schools and their families and their communities could access them easily. We called it Bringing History Home. So this was our main goal of the project. And when descendants go to our site, they're able to just on the search bar, they can put in the names of relatives who attended the school or search for relatives who attended the schools. And that's mainly how we find that tribal people are using our site, is that they're putting in their names and searching for them. And sometimes they write us and they tell us, we can't find anybody, but we know my aunt, my uncle, my grandfather attended the school. And so we also have a lot of things we haven't yet put up online, so we always do a lot of individual searches for people as well. Our other main goal was to educate the general public about what happened in the Indian boarding schools. So you can go to our site too and search. Let's say you're interested in, what happened at the school in terms of the curriculum. What did students learn at the schools? So we've kind of organized this so that you can look thematically as well. Or disease, as we'll talk about a little bit, was a huge problem at the school. So you can search by that. You can search by discipline, etc. So it's also meant to be a place that anybody can go and learn about what happened in schools from like primary sources, which are, for a historian, they're where we start. They're the documents from the past rather than interpretations of those documents. So why Indian boarding schools? Why did they exist? So the boarding schools were really the brainchild of a man named Richard Henry Pratt. And Richard Henry Pratt, you could call him many things. He was a military officer who participated in the Indian Wars. He killed a lot of Indian people. He participated in massacres. And then he was put in charge of Indian prisoners of war from the 1870s. And he oversaw them at Fort Marion in St. Augustine, Florida. And Pratt thought that he had come up with a way to, as he thought of it, rehabilitate these prisoners of war. And what he did was he cut their hair. He made them give up their traditional dress and wear uniforms. He turned them into military companies, and he instructed them in kind of basic Western educational concepts. He required that they attend Christian religious services. And he believed that his work had led to the assimilation of these many of them were young adults, and he thought that he should try this at a grander scale for all American Indian children. So in 1879, he was able to convince the U.S. government to allow him to take over an old Army barracks in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and establish an Indian school. And he thought, again, to do the same thing, to cut all the children's hair as they come to school, to put them in uniforms, to form them in companies like in this picture. And Pratt was really influential. He got a group of humanitarians and reformers from the East Coast, many of whom had been abolitionists and who had opposed slavery. Many of them became very interested in promoting Indian boarding schools. Pratt touted them as this great, beneficial, benevolent gesture, extending education to American Indian children. And a lot of them agreed, and they called themselves Friends of the Indian. And eventually, this is a really influential group of people. They included the likes of people like Harriet Beecher Stowe. And they influenced the government to establish hundreds of these Indian boarding schools. About 25 of them were what we call off-reservation. They weren't in Indian communities, and the others were on reservation, but still pretty far from the children's homes. And then they also established a whole bunch of day schools for Indian children. And then the churches were running a lot of their own schools as well. There were hundreds of those. So at last count, we're around 450 Indian boarding schools. And you'd think we'd know exactly how many there are, but we don't. And it's true in Canada, too. They don't know exactly how many Indian residential schools they had. So boarding schools have affected all Indian families. At the turn of the 20th century, around 1900, I've done a lot of quantitative research, and I found that about 78% of all Indian children who were of school age were in a boarding school at that time. And that only increased into the 1920s and 30s. And by World War II, the government had shuttered a lot of the Indian boarding schools, but they still kept many of them open after World War II, especially for Alaska Natives and for the Navajo or Dene Nation. So you cannot meet an Indian family today that has not been affected by the boarding schools. And as we'll talk about later, they had a really long-term legacy, too, for Indian families. Why did the government create these? So I've long contended that if it were really just about education, they could have done day schools in all the communities, and they would have not been as expensive. They would have not disturbed Indian families, or not to the extent that the boarding schools did. But to the government, they really felt like, they would say things like, if we don't remove the children, they'll fall into their savage ways. They'll never abandon their, quote, savage ways. And so they really thought that removing the children, and sometimes forcibly removing them from their communities and families, was the only way to, as Pratt put it, to save the Indian, to kill the man to save the Indian. So this was also during a time when the U.S. government was getting even more Indian land. At the same time as the Indian boarding schools were in effect, the government was following a policy called allotment. And in allotment, it took communally held native land and allotted it to individuals, and then took back the surplus. Well, the surplus was 90 million acres. And so then that went back into like for homesteading or settling or for public lands like our national forests, our national parks. So for me, it's inescapable that this removal of Indian children to boarding schools was really connected with the dispossession, the further dispossession of American Indians. So as I mentioned, Genoa was our own boarding school. This is one of the 25 off-reservation boarding schools. It was built on Pawnee lands. The Pawnee had negotiated a treaty in 1857, and as part of that, they negotiated for a school, and they did establish a school there. But then the Pawnee were kicked out of Nebraska by 1875, and then in 1884, their old school became the Genoa Indian School. It was open for 50 years. It was the fourth Indian boarding school to open, the fourth federal Indian boarding school. It started out with one building and 320 acres, and it grew to 30 buildings on 640 acres. It employed 500 people in the city of Genoa. It was a big employer, probably the biggest. And we have a count of at least 4,000 students who went through Genoa. I'm sure that's going to grow too as we find more documents. So what was it like for children? So this little boy, you can see, he is probably a fairly recent arrival. His hair is completely shorn. He would have had very long hair. He's in either, it's hard to tell with him if he's in a uniform, but he's definitely in Western clothes. And you can see some of the buildings around him. So in addition to stripping the children of their clothes, their hair, and making them take on a kind of new identity, sometimes they gave them new names. They also forbid them from speaking their languages. And when you talk to Native people today, that's one of the most bitter legacies of the schools, is the fact that so many tribal nations are having trouble. They've lost their language, or they're losing it, or they're having trouble getting it back. So Genoa was just like Carlisle and all the other Indian boarding schools. It organized the children into companies, both girls and boys, and they had to march and drill every day. When you hear oral histories of Native people who attended Genoa or any of the boarding schools, this is something they talk about all the time, this like very rigid regime that they had to live under. They always had to get up at the same time with bells and whistles and go to eat at the same time, and everything was extremely regimented. They only had class for half of the day in the morning. They learned reading, writing, and arithmetic, although some of the children, again, thinking about interviewees that we've talked to, many of them said that they never felt like their education was adequate. And you can imagine only going to school half the time. So what'd they do the rest of the time? Well, they ran the school. They did the labor for the school. So the girls were trained to do a lot of domestic work. They did all the laundry. They did a lot of the cooking. They sewed their own uniforms. So you can get a sort of sense of that here. The boys were schooled to do all sorts of farm labor. And it was kind of ironic because in many of their traditional communities, for example, the Pawnee, it's the women who do the agricultural work. It's not the men. So you can imagine that you're thrust into this new unfamiliar situation, and then as a boy, you're told you're going to now do something that in your tribal nation was considered women's work, and that it was these kind of reversal of gender roles was very unsettling to a lot of the children. So another thing that happened to a lot of the children we know is they often suffered from malnutrition and hunger. The government only provided $167 per year for each Indian student, which was well below what they provided for non-Indian children at their schools. And you can imagine a lot of the children spent most of their formative years growing up in an institution. We know now, we knew then, that institutional upbringing is not healthy for children. They knew that then. They actually had a conference in 1909 about we have to move away from institutionalization of children. It's not good for them. So they knew it even then, but they were still promoting this for Indian children. A lot of the children suffered very harsh physical abuse, punishment for speaking their own languages. A lot of them ran away. If they were caught and brought back, they could expect very harsh punishment, many times solitary confinement. And if you've been following at all what happened in Canada, you know that sexual abuse was a really big problem in the schools in Canada, as it was in the United States, although we don't have many people who talk about it here. But, you know, children didn't just lead this relentlessly dismal, miserable life. They formed new friendships. They did take advantage of opportunities. A lot of the extracurricular activities at the school, at Genoa and other schools, were really popular. The band was really popular at Genoa, and sports were hugely popular as well. And so we have some, you know, major athletes of our nation, like Jim Thorpe, who went through Carlisle, came out of the boarding schools. So, as I mentioned, this left a pretty bitter legacy for a lot of Native families because Native people today talk about intergenerational trauma, that like a lot of what happened to them in the schools was extremely difficult and harsh, and a lot of children who went through the system never learned how to parent. They never learned their traditions that revered parenting, revered taking care of children. They didn't learn that. Instead, they learned this very harsh discipline. So a lot of Native families today really feel that the boarding schools really contributed to a lot of current problems in Indian communities. Sorry, my phone keeps ringing. It's buzzing. So if you hear that, that's what that is. So I wanted to share with you a little bit about what happened after Genoa closed. So it closed in 1934 during the New Deal, and that was a time when the Commissioner of Indian Affairs by then he opposed boarding schools, and he tried to close a lot of them. The townspeople of Genoa protested that they were closing the school because it was employing 500 people. In 1935, Genoa was designated a state hospital for those with mental illness. And then it was converted into a prison farm. And then it lay idle for a while in the late 1940s, and then became part of the University of Nebraska, which used it for a seed farm for many years, but then slowly either sold off or destroyed most of the buildings, which as a historian really break my heart that they destroyed a lot of these buildings. And I think it broke a lot of Indian people's hearts too. Even though this was a harsh place to grow up, it was something that's a real key part of their history. But I also want to flag that date, 1937. That was in the heart of the New Deal, and the federal government established the Loop Power District for the Loop River, and they dug a hydroelectric canal through the Genoa school grounds. And keep that in mind, it's an important thing that happened. So, fast forward back to our own time. So you may have heard that in Canada, they've discovered mass graves at the Indian residential schools. And that has really prompted a conversation in the United States. After that was discovered, our project was getting 4 or 5 calls a week from media, Washington Post, New York Times, Time Magazine, you name it. And lots of filmmakers were coming out to Genoa and wanted to know more about our project and know more about the history of the school. And the Secretary of the Interior, who's a member of Laguna Pueblo, she established an investigatory body into the U.S. boarding schools, and she issued a report on that in June. And she's now embarked on a tour. She's calling it the Road to Healing Tour, where they're going to Native communities around the country and gathering testimony from them about what occurred in the boarding schools. So this had a huge impact on our work at Genoa, because when our community advisors became aware of this, they wanted to know, well, what were there children who died at Genoa, and where are they buried? And we know there was a cemetery at Genoa, so what happened to that cemetery? So this became a really big effort, and we've been working really closely with the Genoa Foundation and Museum. We have a team of researchers working together to try to identify the children who died at Genoa, and to find what happened to them, and to find what happened to the cemetery. I should say too that our community advisors have long been interested in these questions, but it became more urgent with what happened with Canada. So we started doing research into the children's deaths. You can find some information about this on our website. So if you do a search, if you put death in, you will find, about 12 documents. That's not a lot. And then we started digging into other sources, and we have found that 86 children died at the school. We only have the names of 49 of them, and others are listed in reports. We'll find a report from the early 1880s, for example, that says 30 children died this year at the school. And they don't list their names, and we don't know. So then we have a count, and so we're trying to find the names. And first we went to all the government documents, and we were surprised that there weren't a lot of government documents that reported on the deaths. So mostly we've been finding out the names of the children and what happened to them through newspaper reports, either through the local Genoa newspaper or the student newspaper. And that's very telling to me that the government wasn't taking care of these children. It wasn't reporting their deaths to their parents. It wasn't taking their duties seriously as the caretakers of these children. So the causes of the death, we know of 42 of the children. Mostly it was tuberculosis, pneumonia, flu, and heart failure. But we also have cases of accidental shootings, drownings, spinal paralysis, and even freight car accidents. When the children ran away from home, they sometimes tried to jump a freight train, and that sometimes resulted in death. Another really troubling thing about the school is that a lot of times the children became very ill at school, and the school did not want their deaths on its records, so it would send them back to their homes when they were really very ill. For example, in the 1884-85 school year, the superintendent recorded only one death, but he sent home 23 children with tuberculosis who he considered incurable. So then we decided we needed to find this cemetery. And I'm sorry about the quality of this. It's really hard to get a good picture of this map. So this is a plat map from 1920. And I don't know if you can see the little orange reddish circle in the kind of upper right-hand quadrant. There's a cross, and it says CEM, cemetery, right next to it, and then it's circled. And so that's a very imprecise location, but we know there was a cemetery, and some of the children talked about it. Some of the newspaper articles talked about it as well. But today we are not able to find this cemetery, and we don't really know what happened to it. Our team of researchers has been looking at old plat maps, records and blueprints of the Loop Power District, because remember, they dug a canal through there. And we've been going to newspapers and other sources to see if we can find clues. And this is an aerial view of the Loop Canal that was dug through the grounds. And on the left-hand side, that's the main part of the school. The right-hand part is more of like a farm that's on the other side of the canal. So we are working with Judy Gayashkabosh of the Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs and the State Archaeology Office to try to find this cemetery. And we have been using some of the same technologies that they're using in Canada, ground-penetrating radar. And this is a map that shows you the grids that where they've been searching for the cemetery, and on either side of the canal. They have had no luck the first round they had no luck using this ground-penetrating radar. They think there maybe was just too much soil on top of it to be able to detect any anomalies. So then we called in some dogs who are trained to sniff for human remains. And they had them sometime over the winter. And I just learned this recently from the state archaeologists that they had 2 different dogs identify sites independently. So now they're going to be going back very soon to try to do another ground-penetrating radar survey of the area that the dogs identified. So our best guess about what happened with the cemetery, we cannot find any record that any human remains came to the attention of the state. They were supposed to report if they find any human remains when they're doing any federally funded project, and none were reported in the 1930s or at this time. So our best guess is that when the Loop Power District was created and when they dug this canal, they just dug out all this soil and put it on top of the cemetery, which I hope you all realize, like, just how incredibly disrespectful that is to these children who died at the school, and how unsettling that is to tribal families today who want to know what happened to their relatives. So this has become a big issue around the country. We work really closely in a network with the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. It's an organization that started about 10 years ago, and they're based in Minneapolis. And they are launching a campaign to try to get the United States to develop its own, I've got to get this right, the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding School Policies. They would like, and they've got a bill in Congress, both at the House and in the Senate. And they're launching a huge campaign in the next 7 weeks, 6-7 weeks. That's why it's so timely. So I thought I would share this with you because they are asking people to make calls to their representatives to ask that this be established. So with that, I just want to end, and I'm happy to take any questions or any comments that you might have. This is a really important part of Native history and a really important issue to Native families, that they feel like this needs to be resolved in some way for them to bring healing in their lives. So thank you so much, and I welcome your questions.